We are so good at this, man. We are so good at this. Can you tell how like professional this is? Okay.
So just for the audience to know, we just skipped the entire introduction and went straight into the show.
But we were blabbing, so it doesn't matter, right? Now we're getting to the part where we just asked Kemi and Barbara to introduce one another, and Yuri said, and who, we obviously go back and forth and finish each other's sentences a lot. Kemi I think Yuri just asked, how do you know each other?
Yeah, so thanks again for having me on your podcast. So I'm Kemi Olugemo. I'm a neurologist and drug developer, and interested in AI, but definitely far from an expert. And given the title of your podcast, figured that definitely was qualified to discuss this topic as a non-expert. Barbara Salami and I think it's much better if she introduces herself, are both Nigerian-Americans in the same industry, which, we both love very much and have contributed to in various ways. And, she has become, a confidant and a really good friend. And I just really admire her because she really epitomizes the kind of leader that I love to work with and that I've seen really help other people in their careers, both personally and professionally. So very happy that she decided to join us today.
Oh, wow. Should I start crying now? That was
totally. We want emotion.
That would be great.
For the clicks.
So, about Kemi. Kemi was introduced to me a couple of years ago by a mutual friend we have. And I remember when she said, "You'll have to meet Kemi." She was like, she is the kindest and yet the most brilliant leader that she knew. And of course, I wanted to meet her because kind was part of her description. And I feel like, we shouldn't live in this world if we can't be kind to each other. And I gave her a call. At this time, I moved to Massachusetts, gave her a call, and I felt like I had known her all my life. I, too, had been fangirling her for a long time before the intro happened. So I was so happy to be connected to her. And since, I feel, I've found a sister in her. And I learn from her every day as well, too. So just really grateful to be on this podcast with her. She's amazing.
I'm not crying, you're crying. But let me just correct Barb. So you got the kind part. I think I am a kind person. Don't know about brilliance, but I have a lot of passion that maybe is mistaken for brilliance. Thank you.
So one point of clarification, because this makes a huge difference, at least in your families. Are you American-born Nigerian or Nigerian-born American?
I was born in America in Moorhead, Minnesota.
Okay.
And I was born in Lagos, Nigeria.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good. Well,
I hang out with a lot of Nigerians, so I love that conversation.
Yeah. I'm really excited because we have this no experts thing, which is of course sneaky and disingenuous because a lot of the people we've had on, if you've checked out the other episodes, have been people who are have been working in some cases for decades in machine learning and AI and doing stuff with it for their jobs, not as an avocation. So it's sneaky for us to say no experts, but obviously that points to me. I've been a knowledge worker in information technology for a long time.
And you're just sneaky.
And I'm just sneaky, but I've also just I went to bed as a tech writer and woke up as a taxonomist. That's really what's happening in the past 10 years or so. And Yuri and I have known each other for a long time, but in this sort of technical, weird, futuristic topic we're working in, I often have expected that I'd have to ask people toward the end, now that we've talked about all the nuts and bolts, can you tell me a little bit about who you are as a person? So I'm really gratified that you all are showing your cards early and showing up with your personness in the foreground. I think that's magnificent.
So one other element that has emerged behind this no expert idea, and as you'll see, Matt and I, who have not just known each other for a long time, we've known each other for our entire lives, is this idea that AI is eliminating experts. That there's sort of a specter of, well, will anybody be an expert? So I wanted to have, since we started with that, have both of you comment on that the no expert part of this idea.
Kemi, you want to go? I could go.
Yeah, I'll let Bar go first.
Yeah. So I don't know that I wouldn't say AI per se, it will eliminate the expert. I think it's just really going to redefine the role of an expert, right? Because if you think about where everyone kind of has worn a badge of honor based on what they do, right? I'm an expert in terms of operations. I'm an expert when it comes to strategy. I'm an expert when it comes to connecting dots. And many of these things we're describing, AI, and when I talk about AI, obviously generative AI and its derivative sense, without question, can do those things much better and faster. But the things that it cannot do, when I start thinking about experts, our experts have had years of seeing things work and fail. And yes, I know that these models have been trained with, trillions and zillions of data. The reality is experts are the ones who really know and can see around corners. And so this idea of judgment, our ability to, when we use the machine to help us get the effort, the pieces that really require a lot of effort, when we get them to the point where they've done it, we still require us as humans with our expertise, our knowledge, our ability to still work with people to be part of the loop. So I don't think that the role of the expert changes. I think the experts have to become a little bit more comfortable with understanding that your value isn't tied to the quantity of work you do anymore, but the quality of the intuition you bring to a conversation, the conviction you bring, and hopefully clarity of the outcomes that you want the broader team to accomplish.
That's very good.
Kemi, how would you
I like
add
that.
to
Yeah,
that?
but Kemi, let's hear it from you.
Oh, so I love the phrase redefining, what an expert is, and I definitely agree with that. I think it's going to really depend on the industry, the use cases. I think AI is very much a tool that some people really love and use really well, and some people are terrified of because of the potential implications of, loss of income, loss of livelihood, right? And I think those are valid fears. Even just thinking about physicians, right? So I'm a neurologist by training. We all have doctors, some of us, many different types of experts that we see. And I do think that many aspects of AI will replace a lot of the work that physicians do, especially generalist primary care physicians, right? I think that's, that's inevitable. But there are other aspects of practicing medicine. Medicine is both an art and a science. There's the humanity piece, there's emotional intelligence, there's empathy and judgment that I don't think any LLM can really replace. And so I think, this is going to be kind of fluid and evolution, and I would say it depends. But I think it's going to be an ongoing conversation.
So one of the things that we've seen over and over again, actually, I think I've probably seen it in every conversation I've ever had with anyone about AI, is two things come up almost always. Number one is, I'm scared in some way or other. The other one is, I believe, because, for what both of you just said, there's an element of what it is, but then there's also this, what I think or I believe it will become. And there's so much debate about that. And so much of that is just pure speculation. But some of it's informed speculation. So I was just curious, where you put yourselves in that.
So wait,
Yeah.
are you asking? What are you asking? Because I don't know what you're. I don't know
When
your question was.
you're So number one is, are you scared? And then number two is, what do you believe about the future of AI? Or what do you think is some really important things about the future of AI?
So I don't think I would say I'm scared. There definitely are concerns. There are concerns about some limitations of AI and some potential deleterious effects. So, for example, you know, these models are really only as good as whatever input they have and what data goes into them. And we know that if you introduce bias into large data sets, that bias gets perpetuated. And really on a population level, global basis, that could be catastrophic. So I know I just said I'm not afraid, but that is really just an extreme
It's a non-scary catastrophe.
of what could happen. But that is a concern. But I do see that people are addressing that. Like, for example, in clinical trials, for example, we have a lot of genetic databases and genomic data sets that really don't have a very diverse amount of data, and people are actually making steps to try to address that. So I'm hopeful. I'm generally a hopeful person that once we recognize some of these limitations and try to actually address them and tackle them, that over time, such limitations will diminish. So I'm not afraid, but I'm watchful, and I think that there's a lot of opportunity. There's more opportunity than there is concern for me when I sort of weigh the benefits and the risks.
Yeah. So plus one, what Kemi said as well. I am not afraid. Actually, I think by nature, I love to jump into the deep end of things. So when there's new technology, I'm probably right there trying to figure out what's happening. But to Kemi's point, I am also cognizant of the fact that we are dealing with models that have been trained with already biased data, and that in itself, right, has implications. I think when I think about the concerns I have about AI, it's less of, I think there are going to be so many phenomenal things that we'll be able to do, whether it's our ability to diagnose medicines, faster and better. We know some of these models are getting more intelligent, where they actually are beginning to predict things that they've never seen before with a decent level of accuracy. So that's phenomenal. But I'm more concerned about who gets left behind. Maybe my fear around AI is who gets left behind. When you think about every revolution or evolution, and I'm going to think more around the digital component, there are populations that traditionally get left behind, right? I think of this as an opportunity for huge wealth creation, the ability to have more purpose. Like, you could be more purposeful with AI if you know about it and how to use it. And I do think that there are segments of the population who are, because of this fear, because of the doomsday messaging, and and I think we will always have proponents and critics for whatever topic. But there's the messages you see, and maybe I'll say on LinkedIn, for instance, right, is you're not going to have a job, you're too old, right? AI. So it's funny because it's you're too old to learn it. And then you have the younger ones where they're like, well, you're too young, and machines are going to take, agents are already going to take over your job. And then there are people like myself, Black minorities, who in the workplace never feel safe enough to try and fail because the tolerance of failure is much lower. So when I think about the mental models of the people who are showing up today, the people who feel confident to lean in to leverage this technology, it's the same people who have the polish, the pedigree, maybe the deep pockets to be part of whisper circles that majority of the rest of the world, in fact, there are parts of the world, quite frankly, that could barely get food to eat, let alone worrying about having internet access and then using one of these LLMs. So I think that's where my biggest concern is, how do we shift the narrative of AI and adoption and value from it's a skill gap to really an access gap? Because that's the part I'm afraid of, is if we don't help, all tides to rise, then we will basically we would have recreated yet again another powerful technology that does not serve the world.
Now, that's interesting. I have one current to introduce into this, and this is not a yeah, but everything's going to be fine. Believe me, Yuri knows I'm not a sunny side up kind of guy. But in the case of mobile adoption, for instance, one effect that happened, I think it was called leapfrog, I think of it as leapfrog, is that lots of places in rural, remote, developing nations didn't have any copper wire connecting their telephones, right? They didn't have house phones in huge areas. And then when mobile came, immediately a bunch of people mobiled up, a bunch of populations mobiled up in a way that was kind of remarkable, like incredible.
Absolutely.
And I think it's possible, I guess I'm picturing somebody who maybe doesn't have the ability to sit down and learn a bunch of object-oriented programming skills or data analysis skills because they can't afford to get the time, or they're too busy. But I can see them leapfrogging into a learning situation or adoption situation using some of the tools that are just available on their mobile, even if it's an older model, right? So I don't know if you're seeing that in the people you're working with, Barbara, or not.
So I would say, and you're spot on. I'm thinking about my days at GSK when I was in a global role and I was trying to get all countries to come together. US comes with the gravitas of where the US, we got it all. And the reality was, when you looked outside the US, in Africa, in Asia, right, the mobile basically was, the things that we're doing with mobile technology was unbelievable, right? And really helping my US counterparts see that the world does not revolve just around here and everyone can innovate was important. So I agree with you. I think, Joe, the difference with, and I'm not saying that we're not seeing adoption of, generative AI across the world, but I think the difference with this particular technology is, I'm going to use the analogy of a bicycle. I could teach people how to ride a bicycle, right? But first of all, I need them to believe that the bicycle was even made for them, right? This is not, and I do think that culturally, there are so many differences in terms of how people think about artificial intelligence. During my Moderna days, that was a conversation for mRNA, right? Oh my gosh, what is this? They're injecting a chip with this vaccine.
Oh, yeah.
And it wasn't even just outside the US, right? The Japanese had their concerns. So I think my biggest piece is, how do we design not a US-centric view of what this technology can be, and really start building a framework that helps people feel like it was truly built for them to excel. And that's I think that's the piece that I'm seeing. But again, I'm spending a lot of my time with AI conversations here in the US, and there's so many vulnerable adopters who just don't see themselves as part of the conversation, and do not have the confidence, I think that was a word that was used, to basically jump in and feel like they have an opportunity to win.
I think it's interesting, Barb, how you brought up all these different subpopulations, and I didn't even think about the two extremes of age, right? The old and the young, and having different concerns. But I think there's also, and you may have sort of alluded to this, I think that there's an economical divide as well. Really, that includes all races. And you think about, states or parts of the U.S. where, people are, more like blue collar workers, a little bit more impoverished, and they're going to be less likely to really have fluency in just basic AI terminology, right? And being able to use AI versus people who are working in industries like, biopharma, for example, or definitely tech, like comparing those is going to be apples to oranges. So I hadn't really thought about that aspect as well. And I'm curious as to your experience, with what you recently started doing is really helping people to gain basic fluency in AI, right? Like what has surprised you about the conversations that you're having with people who are complete novices?
And I would just add to that question, what does that mean? So what is fluency in AI? Because I think it's something that we sort of take for granted, but I'm not sure if it's well understood.
Yeah, so maybe I'll start with fluency. The way I describe it is the ability to understand how to use AI, when to use it, and what not to use it for, right? That is, how what it can do and what it can't do. That's the fundamental starting part, piece when I think about fluency. Because once you have that grounding, then you start to have a little bit more confidence. Okay, so I know what it can do. I know what I'm still able to have that preserves my humanity. And I now know some of the guardrails, right? I don't have to worry about doomsday, but I also need to be careful. I still need to understand the limitations of this. And I think that's where I start from this idea of fluency is, do you even know how powerful the tool you're working with is or not? And do you understand that in the context of your reality? So what surprised me and I started a company called Kaindly. Like I said, I'm all about kindness. It's pronounced kindly, but
We
it's
were wondering how to say it, so thank you.
yeah, it's kindly. So I replaced the I with AI, but it's grounded in really helping people humanely adopt AI in a humane fashion. What surprised me in the conversations is there are rooted emotional drivers that are preventing people from using this technology. And it doesn't matter, like I've talked to professionals and I've talked to like plumbers about it. And a lot of them have very similar questions. Well, if I'm using it, what am I using it for? Where am I going? Well, I was already told that it's going to replace me, so why bother using it anyway? If at the end of the day, it's probably going to replace me. I literally just spoke to someone who is a senior leader in pharmaceuticals. If you think about when the first models were released in November of 2022, that's almost 3.5 years now, right? It will soon be 3.5 years. This individual told me that he had never touched even ChatGPT.
Since then.
Oh my goodness.
Since then, never ever, never ever.
Yep.
Oh, I know lots of folks like that.
And he's at a company that's tout being
Sure.
AI first.
Sure.
And I said, help me understand why. And he said, well, first and foremost, I don't believe that the data in there serves me as a person of color, a black man. That's literally what he said to me, right? I don't believe that. He said, second, I think that there's too much noise about how something that should be really a tool is beginning to get positioned as equal to me as a human being. And religiously, a machine is not human, right? So it's deep.
So great.
There's religion, there's the reality of the belief that bias has always existed. And if they train this with anything from the internet, I know as a black man, I did not have an opportunity. Then I speak to a plumber. And the plumber's like, yeah, I'm hearing about that. Is it going to fix your toilet when it's broken? Probably not. So you know what, Barbara? I'm not really interested in this conversation, right? This is not really what bothers me because I know that my strength, right? So from their perspective, if it has to do with physical strength, they don't have anything to worry about. So I think what's really just surprised me is the hesitation cuts across. And I almost think that that's the humanity that brings us back together. Every single person on this planet has a vulnerability. And so when
Yeah.
organizations are building these fancy training programs, you can't think of training as a one size fits all. You really have to find ways to meet people where they are and allow them join you in that process of getting fluent from wherever they are. But as you know, many organizations kind of start with, this is the Ferrari. I'm giving you the keys. They don't have paved roads, but go figure out how to make it accelerated.
So
Well, I
I work
I
in
love
a
this because we have so many questions that were meant to elicit exactly these kinds of answers. So
Definitely.
I wanted to just throw one thing in. I was biking to the gym last night, and I was listening to Derek Thompson on Plain English. He has a podcast where he interviews some interesting people, and I like the way he asks questions. And he interviewed David Ricks, CEO of Eli Lilly, and they were talking about GLP-1 drugs. I learned a lot because I didn't actually know about the Gila Monster story or any of those cool things, which are probably breakfast table talk for you guys for the past 10 years. But the cool question he asked, I thought, was, he said there's a polite way to do this and a rude way to do this, but since we've been talking a while, I'm going to go for the rude way. Why do Americans say, according to Gallup, that they hate the pharmaceutical industry so much? Okay, so that one we just want to put there. But for this conversation, I wanted to ask, how do you think they feel? And Barbara's already getting into it, but how do you think people feel about AI? There's a lot of complexity about that, but that's actually a big part of what this podcast is really about. So I just want to encourage people to talk about that a little bit, because Barbara, you started to, and Yuri, you got something to say?
let me add a little bit more. So I work in a university. It's a majority minority institution. We have something like 40% are first gen. So it's real. It's core. It's not a research institution. So its core mission is moving people from working class to middle class. And as we've had these series of conversations, and we'll get to whether or not you heard some of them, I've been trying to interject some of these thoughts about, before you get to the, those sort of deep philosophical ideas of, is it human? Is it intelligent? There's a whole set of other questions that has to do with, well, who gets access? Who created the technology in the first place? This whole issue around trust. Now, one of the things that I've been arguing is I'm amazed by how skeptical people are by the output of the sum of what gets used, but yet they get up every day and they walk out into society where all that stuff, all the idiocy, all the bias, all the difficulty, all the difficulty in the workplace and your social life and everything is all at play. And so how could it possibly be a shock that it then gets compounded and distilled and repeated within these systems that are really just mimicking and parroting to some extent the things that they've been fed? But I am really interested in, well, what's the solution? And for me, it is, yes, first, unless you give people a seat at that table, unless people are able to take trust and ownership and start pushing their way in, because honestly, I think in our country's history, the only way you get in is to push in, right? This country was founded by and for white European men, and then a lot of other people fought and died over and over and over again to say, hey, wait a minute, you said freedom. You didn't just say just for one group. And a lot of people, lost their lives struggling, and they still are. So I'm just curious, how do you get in? How do you establish trust?
That's a heavy question, Yuri. For AI, trust in AI, I don't know that I have an answer for that. I think that we need to start with the very basics in terms of education, so that people are sort of, people have a level playing field, right? And that's where, organizations like Kaindly come in, just helping people have that level playing field where people are fluent in AI and they understand what it is. This is a tool, this is what it can help you with, this is what it cannot help you with, this is how it can enhance, whatever it is that you do in your day job, right? beyond that, now we're going into like, systemic issues, which are probably outside of the scope of this conversation. But I think trust is complicated, and that's a big reason why AI, I believe, will never really fully replace a human being, because of that trust element. Because no matter how good a model is, there are certain aspects of human intelligence that I believe AI cannot supplant, right? But it's definitely not something that's going to be solved overnight.
Yeah. I think just to build upon what Kemi is saying, there we have to have more transparency. Um, and part of, again, part of the transparency is helping people see how these models work. And I will frame this as not, I'm not saying that people need to become mechanics, because in the ecosystem of driving, if I would think about driving, you have mechanics, you have the cars, you have mechanics, you have drivers. And 99.9% of us on this planet are probably going to be drivers. And there will be a few great mechanics, the software engineers and the deep domain experts, no question about that. But when I say that transparent, it's still helping them understand, well, this is how the recipe works. You put fuel in the car so that the car can move. XYZ, you need to adjust your seats so that you have the right posture when you're driving and you can react properly. So that is important. The other part in terms of transparency is the players, the Anthropics of the world, the Groks of the world, or XAIs and the OpenAIs of the world really need to start having real conversations about, we already know that they trained their models using, open data sets, and which we already know are biased, but having conversations about how they're fine tuning and improving these models now to address, different forms of bias that exist, and what types of guardrails they're putting in place to make sure, right, that they don't allow injection of additional bias. It's probably never going to be 100%. There's nothing that's 100%. But I think if those conversations begin to happen, we will see somewhat of a shift. And then the other piece is, I look at the leaders from all these companies, and I don't see diversity at all.
Right.
So how am I supposed to believe? Like, it's the person who wears the shoe knows how it fits and where it hurts. If you don't have people who are wearing that shoe, like Nigeria, we have all kinds of things, the person who basically eats the bone that gets, the fish bone that gets, poked in the cheek, right? If you have never tried that type of bone before, right, you will not know. So having them around the table as we're making these decisions are happening are important. And it comes back to experience. If you have an experience that you cannot see around the corner to help shape or reshape what the future should look like.
I mean, part of my response would be, welcome to America in 2026, at the absolute height of one of the worst backlash periods we've ever experienced. And so it's not even, in my mind, enough to say we hope to guard against bias in systems. We've got entire systems being built explicitly to promote bias.
Yep.
Or, as they say, to promote their truth. And, part of how power works is that power promotes its truth. So I guess what I wanted to do is shift a little bit towards, and maybe use Nigeria as an example, which is, since both of you have some knowledge, hopefully, in that area, which is, so the largest economy in Africa, the largest population. I've actually got several Nigerian students that work for me right now. And so I've sort of always viewed Nigeria as this unbelievable fountain of energy and creativity and technical, like just amazing technical skill. And just the amazing amount of vibrancy that's there. So if we turn this conversation away from a US-centric idea to a global-centric idea, even though, like many other technologies, including the computers that we're all sitting here using, sort of originated within the U.S. It's amazing how things then spawn globally and transform in ways you don't expect. So I'm just curious about, where you see there might be opportunities for either democratization or unexpected consequences or ways to solve these problems that we're talking about that are coming from unforeseen places.
Maybe you want to go?
I have to think about that because I haven't thought about
So,
that in the context of Nigeria or another West African country.
well, I can share some context. So I think you're spot on in terms of the vibrancy of the culture, the people, but it's also a very, very young population. We have a lot of, and for better or for worse, right? The reality is we haven't always been we haven't always had the the luxury of, I would say, great governance. And that's the reality. And I think you'd find that it's probably true everywhere now as it stands.
Mm-hmm.
And what I'm finding, what's really inspiring about, the conversations I'm having with folks in Nigeria, and most recently actually started working with a medical doctor who is thinking about reimagining her entire workflow in her clinic and hospital using AI, is that they see AI as a pathway to prosperity. And so many problems, whether it's budgeting for you have a lot of entrepreneurs, right? Whether it's using AI to simplify budgeting. Well, why do you have to buy, instead of spending $20 to subscribe to a product here? Well, guess what? I could now quickly build an app that we could use, right? So I'm beginning to see many use cases pop up, where they're doing a lot of work in terms of collecting health data, right? So there are a couple of groups now who are beginning to collect health data, helping individuals synthesize their data. We do have a fragmented ecosystem here, as we know all of the different players have clinical data living in their own environments. But now what we're seeing is they're empowering individuals with these apps to say, well, every time you go to the doctor, take a picture. Tell the doctor to give you your information, take a picture, and you basically can use this generative AI skill to synthesize your information. So the next time you go to the next doctor, and if you think it's fragmented here, it's more fragmented there, right? The systems are not necessarily talking, but I'm finding so many ways in which they're empowering themselves, learning because I would say the universities haven't caught up yet. I don't think academics have caught up yet in the US either, but it hasn't been the case there. I'm finding that people are more resourceful. Maybe that's what I should say. They're being more resourceful. That said, in order for it to grow and truly become viable for the economy, I think we need to have the right regulatory frameworks in place to support these individuals who are trying to live better lives, quite frankly. I mean, I think that's what it boils down to.
I agree with you, Barb, and as you were speaking, I was thinking about sort of the virtual piece with healthcare and using like a smartphone, for example, which really everyone has, even in the most remote villages in Nigeria and other West African countries, about how that could really increase access to healthcare. I mean, I think that there's going to be less reticence in a place like that, where a lot of people cannot get access to see a primary care physician, cannot get access to, just basic diagnostic, imaging. You and I know, how things can be dire at some point, and I'm kind of wondering, wheels are turning, by how there needs to be a financial investment, and yes, there needs to be the regulatory framework, but I'm thinking that there's probably a greater likely probability of success there where the need is so great, with respect to the number of trained physicians, healthcare providers, hospitals, compared to the actual population of people who need that help. So maybe that's where the opportunity lies with those young people. It is definitely a nation of much younger people than the
Yeah,
U.S.
I mean, Ghana, great things are happening in Ghana and Kenya and Rwanda. I mean, it's amazing what's happening in the continent. So I'm jazzed.
So I'm remembering a story that I heard that relates to Rwanda, in which, and this is before the emergence of AI, in which a bunch of primarily European-based companies were very excited about this new drone technology that they had come up with, where vaccine delivery and other critical medication delivery could be done in areas where it had always been so difficult because of roads and infrastructure. And there are all these feel good interviews with with these entrepreneurs who are saying we're going to solve these problems. And it was interesting what local people had to say about it, because what they were basically saying is, so here's your new hot technology answer to literally centuries of colonization and neglect, which resulted in wealth extraction, which resulted in lack of infrastructure. And now you're patting yourselves on the back with this new technology. So I'm just curious, where does AI fit in? Because I could imagine all sorts of scenarios, education, medicine.
This is the part where Yuri starts sounding like Matt, because I've been throughout this conversation that we've had for almost more than a year. I've been the one who's like, that's not even a thing. Like AI, they shouldn't even have the I in there, because artificial is all it is. It's not intelligence. So it's interesting.
I'm so glad you said that.
That you would come up with this critique of the way AI can be put in place to solve problems that have been persistent and intentional and extractive and exploitative, like you said. And I suppose it puts you in a strange position, right? I don't know if people come to you, and when you were mentioning the way some of the people you've talked to had suspicion about, like, I'm not interested in this conversation. I'm not going to talk about this because all I hear is it's going to either replace my job or make me irrelevant or whatever. So it's interesting that when you talk about this, there must be some tension between you trying to be assistive and helpful, and people maybe going, whose side are you on, right? Does that something that comes up for you?
Gosh. So there are times when I do have to navigate this duality for really, because I don't agree with everything that how AI is positioned. I don't necessarily agree with how the core architects of the technology have built it, but I do see that the way to change the trajectory of where it goes, if today were the first day of the rest of all of our lives, right? What decision would we make, and where do we want to play? And so I've decided that I want to be part of that conversation and shaping it. But yeah, it's a fine line. I tend to lean towards the optimistic view, which is, as bad as, we might think it is, the reality is just like the pharmaceutical industry, right? People love to hate the pharmaceutical industry, but yes, you go over the counter now and you get Tylenol or ibuprofen. At some point, it was a prescription drug. There's so many of us that have had to go to the doctors, and we've taken medication that has saved our lives one way or the other. And so I think it's the same thing with AI. We might love to hate the founders or the creators, but I think if we think about how we use it to do good and shape the future, um, I feel like that's the better stance to take. Otherwise, you kind of get forced to be a passenger on this journey and you just watch it. So, yes, I do have individuals who are like, well, I'm not really, well, it's not like explicitly, we're not sure where you sit. It gets into like sometimes a debate. And I just get back to, well, where do you want to be? that part of the ship, has sailed, or that part has sailed, and this is where we are now. So where do you fit? Where do you want to find yourself? Passenger or a driver? You can lead it, or you can chase it, or you can watch. Either way, it's moving. And I think that's the way mentally I think about it, even in those conversations.
So I'm sort of gathering that neither of you, and this goes back to that question at the beginning about experts, neither of you are extremely concerned about this idea that's talked about a lot, scarcity of opportunity, right? So yes, even though you'll still need human experts, you're going to need a whole lot fewer of them because the real numbers of true experts has always been small. Where do you stand on that?
So I think we're gonna have new jobs, right? AI is gonna replace some jobs, and then there are gonna be new things that we need to do that we don't even know about now. So, as Barbara said, you can be a passenger or you can be a driver, but it's moving ahead whether we like it or not. And if we don't, if we can decide to bury our heads in the sand and pretend like this has nothing to do with us. And as a plumber saying that is kind of funny to me, because I'm sure nobody thought 20 years ago that cars would be driving themselves, but here we are. Right.
Well, did you hear them rake me over the coals for even daring to suggest that cars could drive themselves?
It's
Okay,
true,
so
because
it's
I was
time to
way
answer the
more.
question. It's time to ask
I
the
wouldn't
question.
have so much confidence in, like your job not being taken over by a machine as a plumber.
Okay.
Well, so it's time to ask the question. Barbara and Kemi, before this interview, did you take a
Right.
minute to listen to any of the podcast's previous episodes?
I did it. I wasn't able to
Okay,
know.
and Kemi?
I listened to one in its entirety and then snippets of another conversation.
Which one did you listen to?
But it's been a few weeks.
Sure.
So
Which one did you listen to? Do you remember?
it was
Was
the
it just
very first
Yuri and
person.
myself going back and forth, or was
No,
it
there was, you had a guest.
Was there a German guy?
German accent?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
it was Selbst. Okay.
Good. So you heard the one in which they repeatedly, raked me over the coals for saying that cars actually are driving themselves, or that's a problem even slightly worthy of solving.
So
Yeah, I probably did, but I think that was the one where I listened to snippets of it, and the one with just you and Matt was the entire conversation.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we have a little more data. That's good. We have one person who showed up despite having okay. So that, and then we have another person who didn't. That's great. Either way is awesome.
Yeah, I think, and I mentioned this to you before, the comment or sort of my observation was the philosophical nature of the discussion, which I know you
Definitely.
love. And which we're, sort of having right now, like what
We are.
what is, and sort of trying to make that prediction of what's going to happen in the future. But beyond that banter, I think it is important, at least for me, to really think about the right use cases for AI and to make sure that we're using it judiciously and that we're really making use of it as a tool, because I do think it's a very powerful tool. I think about what it's been able to help us do to develop drugs, and there's still a lot that can be done, but it takes 10 years on average to develop a new therapy with a cost of somewhere around $1 billion. And to go back to your point about people vilifying the pharmaceutical industry and loving to hate us, all of the blame of the cost of drugs is sort of heaped on the industry, typically executive leadership, right? When this is a problem that is multifactorial. And part of the reason it takes so long to develop a drug is because just finding the right drug target and understanding that target, understanding the biology around it and how to drug it in a way where it's both effective but yet safe can take several years. And some drugs were found by serendipity, and very few drugs were actually found by actually really understanding biology and looking for, biology and chemistry, marrying them together and looking for a target and designing a drug to actually interact on that target with precision, right? But that's what AI has enabled us to do now. Like, assessing targets and picking the right targets is a lot faster. Where it's been truncated, right? From like a process that can take years to, in some cases days, right? So that's huge because you're cutting that life cycle short, within which you can develop, a new treatment for people who desperately need it. And that's just the beginning, right? So, and then you have, animal testing, and then you have human testing. Human clinical trials are the most lengthy and expensive. And we know that there are various ways in which AI tools can help us to shrink that. And there's some things that AI can't help us with, right? Well, yet. Like, for example, I think about conducting toxicology studies, right? Like the duration is a duration, and that's, what the FDA has sort of set and other regulatory authorities. But there, other aspects in terms of, truncating the review time, looking for, signals for safety. Like they're looking for patient population, like, patient recruitment and retention. So there are tons of ways in which we can really shrink timelines and effectively make the process much more efficient in the way we develop drugs.
I want to mention Derek Thompson's conversation with David Ricks from Eli Lilly. He said, Derek was asking, like, why can't AI just help more? And I think...
Wait, who are these two people?
So
I have no idea.
Derek Thompson does a podcast called In Plain English, or Plain English, economics podcast, where he interviews people, and a lot of times the conversations revolve around AI or introduce AI concepts. And it's just from a couple days ago, but David Ricks, the CEO of Eli Lilly. And one of the things that he was saying, this relates directly to what Kemi was saying just now, is that the reason you can't just feed a bunch of pharmaceutical data, research data, into an LLM, for instance, is because the language, like biology, human biology, and chemistry, as you were saying, doesn't obey the rules of human language. Human language is actually a really imprecise way to derive those rules, and so they need a language to encode, some kind of ontology type of language that encodes the way the human body works, the systems in it, this chemistry and the genetics and things that, and I'm giving a really probably a lousy translation of this, but he said, our understanding of the way the human body functions is maybe at 15% to begin with, much less the fact that we haven't encoded this into anything that a new kind of AI could use to deliver real reasoning instead of just inferences based on lots of piles of words. So he said they are investing in it, Eli Lilly is. So I was just going to ask you, Kemi, if you know if there is a specific language or a term for how that stuff is encoded, if there's an ontology, I don't know if they use OWL or what, that is in your work that you could talk a little bit about.
Yeah,
something that AI could understand.
I don't, unfortunately, because I'm not involved in those aspects.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let me add, but we are sort of drifting in a good way into a conversation we had with Jobst Landgraf, and that's the German medical researcher, AI researcher, who's been using AI for a long time, who has basically arrived at a proposition, which is that AI will never exist. Artificial intelligence, by definition, is mathematically impossible, because intelligence is really a human attribute based on human biology. And he gives all sorts of, and he says it's basically, it's contrary to the laws of mathematics and the laws of physics. And, we did our best to debate it. My brother's a physicist, so I actually added my brother's arguments against it, which are very strong. But he gave some really interesting examples within oncology, in which Kemi expressed the same idea of how amazingly well it accelerates certain processes, identifying certain proteins, for example, that really can have massive ramifications in terms of speeding up things that would take years and could eventually take months. But he also talked explicitly about AI will always fail in a novel situation. always. It cannot recognize something new. And so he gave an example of it came up against a protein, a cancer-killing, or it was a cancer-killing compound, and it was not able to understand, because it had no context for the fact that that compound would kill the cell, right? He himself, because he's a human, was able to work through scenarios that allowed him to then finally come up with the one that would kill the cancer, not the cell. But the AI, because it was facing a novel situation, is going to fail. And you can really, and this could really go to both of you, because this idea can be extrapolated everywhere. You know, that AI will never do anything new.
So no, you go ahead, Barb, first.
I don't agree with that. I do think that you still need to have, you're still going to need a human. But as I mentioned, right, one of the things that we're seeing right now with even Google's Gemini's new model is that it's significantly improved in its ability to accurately predict outcomes based on things it has never seen before, or things that it was not trained on. So I don't think, again, as we know, it's never going to be 100%, right? So I think that's a reality. But I do think that there will be new things that it hasn't seen before. Hallucination is, at the end of the day, it's trying to guess, right, and give you new ideas. And I do think that we will see the hit rates might not be very high, right, in terms of success, but I do think that we will get there. I don't think it's, so when I think about like AGI, which is basically, this is the machine equates to a human, it will never be the case. But the reality that we might be able to identify a target, a novel target that cures a disease or treats a condition, I think it's feasible. I don't think it's impossible. I don't think we're there yet, but as these models get better, right, because the beautiful thing too, I would say, is the competition among these players is super intense. And everybody wants to get better. We probably will get to a point of like marginal returns, but I don't think that we've seen maturity. Maybe if there's any mature, we're probably at maybe 20% of where it can get to. I think the competition is going to push them to a point where we will have the ability to predict things that the models have not been trained on. And I believe like the Googles of the world are trying to get there.
So I've heard a lot of people say that AI cannot create something new or novel. It just uses, whatever information and data out there. But there's some aspect or element of pattern recognition which can help you with that prediction. And maybe that's part of what Barbara was alluding to with respect to something that's quote unquote novel. But overall, I think, I'm not really sure if that is a sufficient enough critique of AI, because when I think about I think about the pace of novelty when you rely just on human intelligence.
Right.
It's not impressive. Okay. So
right. This is another thing we've been arguing about
Yuri
a lot.
said this too. Like, what's so great about humans? They're kind of repetitive.
Yeah.
They're programmed.
I'm like, okay, look, machines will not replace humans, but that argument in of itself is not the one I would use to sort of minimize the benefits of AI because it can't create something novel. I think that's ridiculous. That's just my personal opinion.
So the framework for that argument in part is, and we used aviation as an example, which is humans, we could never create a computer that could recreate the biology of a bird flying. Right? That's kind of impossible, because there are certain parts of it that are just so beyond our comprehension and so complex that they could actually never really be reflected by mathematical probabilities, for example. However, human beings are able to simulate in a closed system a machine that does flight extremely well. Not only does it do flight extremely well, it does it better than any bird could possibly, if you measure that by power, by the ability to lift heavy objects, the ability to escape the atmosphere, all sorts of criteria. And so the arguments around AI are often, no one is saying that anyone's going to create something that is a biological, is a mathematically expressed reproduction of the human brain. But they are going to, just like our computers actually, you're going to approximate systems, and then you're going to leverage the capabilities of things like silicon chips and computer memory, which are way faster and more efficient by exponential amounts than what the brain does. So you're going to get somewhere remarkable, even though you haven't mirrored biology.
Yeah,
And why do you need to be a bird, right?
I agree.
Well, T.H. White says we all want to be a bird. I mean, in the Merlin legend, his part of his training was going through and being everyone sort of. It's almost like a yoga thing where he got to be a worm, he got to be a hawk, he got to be all these things, and it was a part of this wonderful expansion of consciousness. But I do want to say that this an illustration of this question of belief, right? Belief in technology. The old joke about the graduate student who says, "I know it works in practice, but I can't tell how it works theoretically." So when we interviewed Chris Fregley, who was like deep in the trenches of making AI systems work, he actually put out a 1,000-page book on O'Reilly about performance tuning the systems that run AI. And he said that when he went to high school, his physics professor, who was also his football coach, so that's a red flag right there, this guy who apparently looked a lot like Albert Einstein, but maybe Albert Einstein like 6'4". He said that guy would never take a plane. He would never fly because he didn't believe that he couldn't figure out how to prove using his physics skills.
He couldn't prove that flight was
possible. And so Chris Fregley's experience was, oh my God, how am I going to get into a good school if physics is being taught to me by a person who doesn't have this relationship? So I think a lot of us are in that situation are at that crossroads with AI. And Barbara, you're talking to a lot of people who are who are just considering how they feel about this right now. Like, do I want to get involved at all in this? So I think it's good that humans are having this conversation because we're the ones who need to navigate this and learn how to talk about it.
Well, I think there's just something that we have to help people remember. This was created by AI, whatever you want to call it. It's bits and bytes, right? Literally created by humans. And I think we need to stop separating this from what I would call the spiritual side. Now I'm going to get into like spiritual. God created human beings. AI is not God. And so even when you start trying to equate it, when that's the argument, well, are you going to be able to create the biology or the biochemistry that allows a bird to fly? You are actually subconsciously elevating this thing that is a tool, that is a helper to a supernatural being. And I think we have to help people separate that. It's not going to,
Best
even
of luck
if
with that.
yes, even if they could create robots, the robots are not going to have they will never be us, right? So I think it's really important that people stop thinking about it from the perspective of, well, can it create a human that looks like me? And rather, can we build something that can accelerate how we think, can accelerate how we get things done, actually, so that we can spend what's left of our lives enjoying the things we like doing more. Like, how do you help shift the pessimists to become, more optimistic? And I'm not saying it's easy, but maybe if more of us are talking about it and also talking about this idea, this concept of think about becoming a driver and not just a passenger, that we will get more people leaning in and helping shape the very things that they're afraid of, right? So that it works for them and for all of us.
Make it less
Barbara,
threatening.
Barbara, you said something earlier that really I wanted to come back to, which was the gentleman that you were speaking with who said that, when interacting with an AI, you're confronted with something that actually it's a bit of an insult to faith, because it's it's simulating something with a soul.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I don't know if you've had this experience, but if you've got the purchased versions of the chatbot, with memory,
Mm-hmm.
it starts to gather a lot of information about you, and it will start to offer up assessments of you and your personality, and sometimes they're extremely true. And it's using the language of I'm thinking, I see, I'm trying, I feel. So they have programmed it to speak to the emotional language that we all use when interacting with something with a soul. Now, I'm going to reveal a bit of my bias. My bias is I don't, I don't see this as separate from humans. And if you push me on it, I'm going to say I don't see this as separate from God either. Because all of these things, if God creates all of existence, then AI is within all of existence. And it's an outgrowth of humanity. It's an outgrowth of the worst of humanity and potentially the best. So when I hear somebody trying to separate humans from AI and say this has a soul but this doesn't, I'm like, well, wait a minute. The thing with the soul created this. How are you separating it?
It created a tool. It created a widget. It
Mm.
might pretend to be more than a widget, but it is a widget. I mean, maybe I'll tell you what I'm afraid of is
Yes,
when
that's
we
what we
Mm.
want
move
to hear.
from we've moved from generative, and now we're talking agentic, but eventually we'll get to super intelligence built into these robots. All I'm thinking about is if I would love to have someone that can clean my house and do my laundry. I mean, I would get one, right? But then I'm afraid, I'm like, what if there is some kind of warfare or attack and it's so intelligent and it stops listening and it gets redirected? Now
I-
now this
I've
is
seen
me.
that movie many
Yeah.
times.
That's me going on the deep
Oh,
end.
Barbara,
And I can't,
you
it's
broke
stronger
up. I
than
didn't
me
hear
to
what you said.
steal. Oh, I was just saying, right? So Kemi, I'm saying, well, what scares me is having a robot, which I would love to have one that can do my laundry, do everything I need, but it's stronger than me. It's built with titanium or whatever. And if there's some kind of warfare or an attack, and it's redirected to harm myself and my family, then I don't
Ah,
have the physical strength. Right, that's my biggest. I don't have I could have it's glitchy. I wouldn't have the physical strength. So that's where I'm worried about. It's like when it starts moving from the widget that I still have control over, and then becoming something that is trying to simulate movement like the way I do, but is more powerful than I am. How do I control that? That's what I'm afraid of. Like that's
yeah.
the part that gets me concerned, not
That's a
any
very
other.
specific fear.
Yes.
Well, I think here's what I think. I think that we've been all been talking about how AI can help us, right? But because there is in software, which I lived in for a long time, there's this notion of the separation of concerns. So you could be working on one little piece, the authentication of a payment, but you're not working on the part where it connects to other banks and other places because that's separate. You're in your little part. The part about controlling what is specifically motivating or who it's helping. I think, AI is going to help some people a great deal and not necessarily the customers first. It'll be helping, I'm going to use a sci-fi term, overlords, the people who own this stuff. And that's the part I raise concern about, regardless of whether it can be said to have a soul or be part of creation or whatever. Obviously, it's just as real as math is, right? I can't see math, but I know that I don't know the rules very well. But AI exists just as much as any other concept or conceptual framework. The thing that's, I think, alarming about it is it's changing so fast. None of us have really a very stable definition of it. And so when we talk about it, most of us are talking about LLMs, right? And there are only a few stories that I hear that describe, that talk about AI being used to model real world scenarios in the real world, physical 3D space, about how things work and what weather does, or how to build, using robots to move things around, or whatever it is. LLMs are just the tip of the spear in a lot of ways. There's a whole bunch of other threads of AI that aren't too much part of our consciousness, and I want to kind of I want to do some digging on that. The other thing I just want to mention is that when we talk about what we're finding out, Yuri talked a little bit about the development of computers and the development of computer languages being mostly Western and mostly centered in the U.S. in the beginning. The AI threads that are happening in Asia are almost completely opaque to us. We're not hearing much about them, and there's a great deal of activity going on there, and it's hard to know even what that's going to mean. So there's so much uncertainty about this, and so much attention that's being brought to this thing that is really hard to define. And that's part of what I think the job of culture is, to find out, usually after a war, culture steps in and
in
says,
the time
who
we've been
won and why.
together, it's already changed. And
I
this is
agree.
why, and this is why static trainings don't work. People have to continue to be in it somehow, learning and pressure testing, because what a model did for you last week, you could take the exact same prompt or context and get something completely different.
Agree.
Right.
And
Well,
so,
Kemi mentioned the S word, and I'm glad you did, which is superintelligence, right? Because a lot of the most extreme forms of these kinds of conversations really center around superintelligence. And I'm going to just give you the way I see it, which is this: number one, the idea that something now starts to exceed the smartest human that ever existed, and it starts to train itself, right? So those are some of those key aspects of superintelligence. And then you start asking yourself, well, if something is smarter than any human, the scenario that I heard that I liked was, imagine you have a dog and you go to work every day. So I go to your dog and I ask the dog, what does she do every day at work? So that will soon be what it's like asking us, what is the superintelligent thing doing? So how do we exist within that context, right? And you're talking about, well, what am I afraid of? I'm still more afraid of what bad people will do. And the thing that stops superintelligence from being restrained is, I think, Kemi, you also mentioned this, which is competition, right? The amount of competition between these key companies, one of which is in China, right, is so intense that they're just not going to stop. They're not going to slow down.
That was Barb's comment. Yeah. So now you have to have someone from Asia as a guest on your next episode.
We should. 75% of all internet traffic is in Asia. And so talk about a whole world that we may not be seeing clearly.
so I have a question for you. What keeps you up at night when you think about AI and where it's headed? What
Matt,
excites
you go first.
What excites you? What keeps you up at night?
I think consolidation of power is my main concern. One of the things that Yuri and I have talked about in the first couple episodes of this podcast, and before we started turning these into podcasts, they were just conversations. Was a lot of the things that people say, oh, AI is going to do this terrible thing, right? Oh my God, watch out for AI. It might consolidate most of the wealth in the human world into a few hands. Well, guess what? That already happened before AI was even on the radar, right? That's happened in a lot of ways. The three fears that Jobst mentioned, I think, are a pretty good starting point. One of them is mass surveillance. Another one, and again, like social media, got it. We all just walked into the cattle chutes on that one. And then mass propaganda, right? I think that electronic media of any kind has always been used for that anyway. But AI gives, you can intuitively go, it wouldn't take very long for someone to go, hey, if I plug this in, what happens, So mass propaganda and manipulation, that's a real scare, a real fear. And then weapons, AI-powered weapons, not at all a hard leap to make. That any technology that gets developed is usually proven on the battlefield first, and then, as I was mentioning before, culture steps in to try to talk about why it makes sense that happened that way. So those things scare me, but also I try to be a person who, when I'm scared about something, I go look, and try to have a conversation about it, try to poke at it and find out, well, is this going to blow me up right now? Because, or whatever. So those are the things. Yuri, what about you?
Well, I hate to say how many things I'm scared of. I probably would start with, I'm in the U.S. because my family was sort of arrived here out of the aftermath of genocide. My father is a Holocaust survivor, and the idea that the world could rise up against you in lethal ways is something I worry about in general. My kids are African American. And I'm very, very aware of a worry around this idea of scarcity and, the right now shrinking idea of what we call whiteness, but it's really just a power structure, a dominant group of people that is sort of keeping power amongst themselves and have kind of constructed the world in ways to favor that. And so all of those mechanisms, all of which predate AI, and how they can be manipulated by those kinds of surveillance systems, but even more, what happens if AI really does create opportunity scarcity, not only among the traditional groups that have always been excluded, but now starts to eat into big segments of the middle class, for example, and of that dominant group. That in the history of the United States. And, you could use Nigeria as another example. When that sort of thing happens, the more vulnerable groups are absolutely the first to suffer. So I really worry about that in an immediate, like today kind of worry. And yes, I am worried about superintelligence. That scares me. Something that's actually smarter than any human. But I think these conversations have made me less scared because we have had some very interesting experts on to say, hang on a second, that's a little bit of a fantasy. And even the approximation can't get you quite that far.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe a way of really narrowing down, summing up my fear, and this is a response to why are we doing this podcast? I don't want to be alone when any of this stuff goes down. It's going down. I don't want to be, I want to have companionship and talk about it with folks and new people and people I've known a long time. And that is tremendously satisfying to me. So it's so beautiful to hear other perspectives, other people's beliefs, and share their conversations. And of course, continuing to argue with Yuri, like I have all my life, as vociferously as possible, is always a joy. So not being alone is I think, a fear.
Yeah.
Way to put it.
Kemi, to respond to something you said from the very first moment we started talking, which is, wow, you guys, your conversations are very philosophical. This is something that I actually love about AI, which is it forces literally everyone to have philosophical conversations, whether they expect to or not.
Yeah. It's a little sobering to end on this kind of note. I think rather than, it's important to acknowledge our fears. Definitely don't want to be paralyzed or perseverate on them. And I think we're having the right conversations and about being in the driver's seat, about making sure that, we're focusing on access, and we're looking at, what are those, where are those areas of concern where, if ignored, they could have, just those, really fatalistic consequences. But we have to, I think we have to be solution focused, and we have to have hope, and we have to remember the fact that at the end of the day, this is a tool that we created, that humans created, and there's always going to be an element, even though there's still God's creation, Yuri. This is going to be an element that humans have that machines just cannot replicate. Empathy, which is huge, critical, I think is one of those.
Now, we could spend 3 more hours just talking about empathy. It's such a good question.
But I feel really, like I said, really grateful that you all folks joined and engaged with us and gave us so much of your thoughts and your concerns, and also your sort of insistence on, hey, we have to get up in the morning, we have to do stuff, right? So Kemi, I appreciate your more brass tacks attitude about it. I think that's awesome. So I mean, we're here showing up, we're trying to think this through with people and trying to get some expression of what people's thoughts are about it. We've gone really into the weeds on some of these interviews about how things are being built, how things are being tested and scaled and tuned, and how people are using them. So that's a really great part of the conversation. We're also talking to people who are kind of, not that they're avoiding AI, but they're actually preparing with more interest what everyday human life is like. So I call those people dry landers, right? There are people who dive in and go, the only way to deal with this huge wave, this tsunami, is to dive in and swim furiously, because that's the only way to survive. There are other people who are like, I'm going to prepare some dry land stuff, because there's got to be some area where it is left even when the wave recedes. So both of those
I wanted to make
I think are important.
I wanted to make a quick plug, and by the way, we'll put some of this into our show notes as well, because I know we're at the end of our talk, and I don't want this to get lost. But I wanted to make a plug for Kaindly. I spent quite a bit of time reading through your website and reading about it, and you convinced me that not only is it really important what you're doing, but that who's doing it is critical. And I really wish that venture the best of success, and I'm going to keep following you, and I'm really looking forward to hearing how that goes.
Yeah,
Thank
same
you.
here. Yeah.
Thank you. We're really grateful. Two of us, 2 Black women, decided, you know what, there aren't enough of us out there talking about this. We'll do this. We'll stand there so others. And I would say what you say. Courage is not the absence of fear, right? It's just that we are convicted that we need to be there and helping lead. And so we are being courageous. We are lifting and meeting people where they are. And our hope is by 2030, we would have touched at least 1 million people in fundamental ways. So that's the hope. So
amazing.
thank you so much for the plug.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Seriously,
Thank you
mean
both
it.
for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great talking with you.